It was like a fiery rage, sweeping its way across every inch of land. The bone-like trees all devoid of any life they once had. The fields were purely white with snow that constantly swirled around. Stations, streets and towns were nothing but deserted. Any and all life was tucked away, avoiding the great blizzard that fell upon them. No one would be bold enough, or perhaps stupid enough, to battle such a fierce entity. No one, that is, except one engine and his crew. A small tank engine made its way through the great force, his 6 small wheels pounding far more than they usually would, to keep a grip on the icy rails. Large puffs of steam shot out from his short stumpy funnel, only to immediately vanish into the air. His paintwork was as grey as his surroundings, so much so, he would need to make very little effort in camouflaging himself from any danger. The crew was on never-ending alert. The driver peered hard through the cab windows, doing his best to spot any potential obstacles on their path. Even with a bright lamp at the front of the engine, there seemed to be little difference. Meanwhile, the fireman swayed from bunker to firebox, frantically shoveling large lumps of coal into the flames. For as long as there was a high amount of steam, they would carry on. They had already travelled a great distance, covering many miles of track. Though it seemed they were running aimlessly, they had a destination in mind, and no matter what, they were determined to reach it as soon as they could, no matter their present situation. Surprisingly, to this group of individuals, the current environment they were within was the least of their concerns. In fact, ironically, it was this environment that could play a part in their survival. Through the constant noise of the blizzard, a haunting howl of a steam whistle could just be made out. It echoed all around the engine, and combined with the temperature, it could have been enough to freeze him in an instant. To anyone, it was just an ordinary whistle. To the tank engine, it marked the approach of a sinister presence. It was a presence that had stalked the little engine for months, when he worked, when he refueled, even when he slept. It was always somewhere, everywhere he went. The tank engine tried any ideas he had to avoid it. One time, he hid among endless rows of wagons in the yards. Another time, he coughed and spluttered in front of everyone, tricking them into thinking he was too ill to work. Each time he tried, and each time he only succeeded for a little while. In the end, it always found him, and it never left. Of course, the engine tried telling others about it. The bigger engines were always dismissive. "Don't be absurd," they often laughed. "Such an engine doesn't exist. You expect us to believe such ridiculous lies?" Even engines his size paid little attention. "You might just be seeing things," they soothed. "Maybe you just need more sleep." It was very fortunate that only the engine's driver and fireman seemed to believe in his claims. They would listen to his descriptions of the mysterious entity, always disturbed by what they heard. Nevertheless, they stood by him, ensuring him that they were always there. Regardless, this endless nightmare showed its effects in the engine's work. He moved slower, he couldn't pay attention, he made mistake after mistake. It eventually caught the attention of the managers, and it soon came to his attention that his days could be numbered. He knew very well what fate would await him, and was more lost in fear than ever. It was then, however, that his driver shared an alternative fate. to simply leave their old workplace behind in search of a new one that would happily take them in. And he knew one such place. It was an island, he said, simply known as Sodor, and on it a new railway was nearing its completion. Its engine fleet was small, and they were still on the hunt for new additions. The tank engine could easily be one of them. The driver had studied the maps and knew the quickest way there. And so they were here, out in the thunderous blizzard, approaching ever closer to this island. The danger was high, but it would be no different if they stayed. Besides, the engine believed it was a perfect plan to finally free himself from his stalker. But as he heard that howling whistle once again, any hope he had was quick to vanish. "Driver, is there anything behind us?" he called. The driver looked outside the back windows. He stared hard, but only saw a blank grey wall of rushing snow. "Can't see a thing," he replied. "No one's as mad as us to be out here." The tank engine appreciated the driver's humour, but it was futile. The whistle sounded again. "It's coming," he whimpered. "What was that?" "It's coming. It's coming. It's following us." "Following us?" exclaimed the fireman. "How do you know?" "I can hear it," cried the engine. "I can hear its whistle. It's behind us." The driver and fireman exchanged worried looks. In some respects, they wished they were capable of viewing what their engine saw. At least they would fully know what they were up against, and what to look out for. Otherwise, they were completely blind. "Is there anywhere where we can hide?" asked the engine. "Oh please, there must be somewhere." The driver pondered. He thought back to the maps and the route he chose. He tried to picture in his mind any details he saw, anything that could aid them in this moment. Suddenly, he remembered it. "We should be coming up to a small yard," he called out. "There's a shed there we can hide in." So they struggled on. The tank engine used all the strength he had to charge through, to ignore the continuing wail behind him. Soon, the engine noticed a change in the track. It wasn't just a long stretch of line anymore. Now, there were points up ahead, leading to his left. He looked up and gasped. The driver saw it too, and quickly slammed on the brakes, bringing them to a halt. A set of sidings came into view, some taken up by half-buried wagons. The main sight, though, was a shed. Only one line ran through it, but its length and closed-in structure made it the perfect cover. The fireman wasted no time and jumped out of the cab to the point lever. He was immediately met with the icy wind, but he pushed through. Eventually, he reached the lever, and with all his strength, he pushed it. He waved frantically to the engine, the signal for them to advance. The driver tugged the regulator, and the engine rattled over the points. The fireman then switched the points back to the main line. He was unsure if it would make a difference, but he thought it best to take no chances. The tank engine quickly pulled into the cosy little shed. The windows were grubby with soot, and the corners crowded with webs. Nonetheless, it was enough. The fireman quickly rejoined them and climbed into the cab, to then thrust his hands at the fire. Now, they all sat there, making no sounds beyond their heavy breathing. The engine stared through the shed windows, listening carefully to every sound. He hadn't heard the whistle for a while now, and he couldn't figure out why. Did they lose it? "Can you hear anything?" asked the driver. The engine stayed silent for a moment. He would only give an answer when he was sure. For now, he chose to hold on to his reply. It was well that he did, for as he sat there, a new sound emerged from the blizzard. It was a puffing sound, the kind that a steam engine makes. It often resembles the sound of quick breathing, but this breath was slow and heavy. "It's outside," whispered the engine. The driver and fireman jumped up in alarm. Outside?" shivered the fireman. "It's here already?" "Shh!" The fireman was quick to hold his shaking tongue, reminding himself of why they were sheltered in the shed in the first place. The engine turned back to the outside world, and then he gulped. In that moment, as he had done many times before, he envied his driver and fireman. In fact, he envied every single being who wasn't cursed to witness what he did. Crawling through the grips of the blizzard, echoing its presence through its puffs and wheezes, was a sight that could forever haunt the poor little tank engine. He still couldn't fully decide if it really was an engine. It certainly had the shape of one, a shape of a tank engine, just like him. But is there any normal engine that is always shrouded by a black, thick mist that endlessly swirled around it? Does any normal engine creak and ache in an unnatural way? Surely no normal engine was capable of operating while seemingly being stripped down of many essential parts. And unless there was a fault in the coal, no normal engine shot out large black smoke from its funnel. The answer was all too obvious. This was no engine. Was it some sort of creature? One that could imitate engines? Perhaps it actually was an engine long ago, but is now merely an old soul that lives an endless, painful life. The tank engine wasn't one to believe in silly fantasies like ghosts or demons, and he still didn't. But this was no fantasy. This was very much real, but only he suffered the burden of viewing it. The driver and fireman's visions were spared from such a sight, but all the same they looked out the windows in the vain chance of perhaps at least seeing something. It was good for their minds that they couldn't. The tank engine held its breath as the entity gradually passed by. It didn't stop, it didn't even slow down. It just went at the same sluggish pace in the search for its prey. He had no idea if it noticed the sheds, or the sidings, or even at least the points. But he didn't want to think about it. He just wanted this to end. He just wanted to carry on and reach his new home, to leave this nightmare far behind for the rest of his life. He guessed he was silly to think it would be so simple. Eventually, the dark shape began to fade through the blizzard. It had completely passed, and they remained undetected. Still, the tank engine stayed in silence, and so did his crew. They both agreed to let their engine have the final say on when to do anything. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the entity was gone. It was no longer in the tank engine's sight. Truthfully, he felt rather bewildered. This little shed was all they had to hide under the creature's eyes, and it worked. At least, he hoped so. A few more minutes passed, and at last he spoke up. "It's gone now," he said. "It's been gone for a while. I think we can carry on." "Are you sure?" inquired the driver. The engine winced. Secretly, he hoped he wouldn't be given such a question. Now, he really wasn't sure. But now that it had passed by them, there was little chance they would run into it again. After a few more seconds, he took a deep breath. Yes, I'm sure. All right then, replied his driver. Let's get going then. And so they did. They slowly crept out of the shed and were reunited with the chilling winds. Not that they had cared to begin with. The path to their destination was now more clear than ever. That was all that mattered. No one kept track of time. It felt like a blur to the engine and his crew. The ever-static view around them didn't help much. Gradually, though, the winds began to soften, and their visions were now more clear. The dark, snowy clouds shifted as well, revealing hundreds of twinkling stars shining down upon them. Though they had managed to cope with the raging blizzard, it was a welcoming sight. Then, up ahead, the tank engine spotted something that stood out from the white hills and bare trees. His line led to a bridge, one that stretched very far to another piece of land. The driver looked outside the cab, and when he got a good look at it, he nearly leapt with joy. "That's it!" he cried. "That's the bridge to Sodor! We made it!" The engine's mouth dropped open. "Really? This is it? Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure," laughed the driver. "Come on then, no time to lose." They quickly puffed over the bridge. They began to feel worn out, the effects of the long journey now taking its toll on them, but they didn't stop. Soon they spotted bright orange lights ahead. They got a little closer and found themselves outside a small yard. Much of it was covered in high blankets of snow, and the nearby wagons did not fare any better. Further in the distance, they could just make out the shapes of platforms, a clear sign of a station. Though it seemed deserted, as all the previous stations they had passed, it seemed far more inviting. Suddenly, the tank engine froze. There was a whistle. Somewhere in the distance, it bellowed towards them. He felt the whole world crumbling all around him. Did it find them? Is it here? "That's an engine approaching," called the driver. The engine blinked. "What? You heard it too?" "Yes, of course I did. Look, there it is." They all looked ahead as a small engine, a tender behind its cab, with several trucks following, pulled up next to them. It surveyed the visitors with surprise. "Oh, hello there," he said. There was clear confusion in his voice. "Who might you be? Never seen you around here." The tank engine had lost his voice. He was recovering from the fear of who the whistle might have belonged to. He hadn't a clue of what to respond with. But fortunately, he didn't need to just yet. "We apologize for the intrusion," replied the driver. "We have come from the mainland in search of work. We're here to offer our services." The engine raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? I wasn't aware our director had purchased a new engine." "Well, he didn't. We went on our own accord. You see, our engine here has been treated unfairly. We want to give him a proper home. I'm aware this railway is still in search of engines, so if we could explain everything to your director, I'm sure our engine will be able to fit in on this railway." The tender engine and his crew thought it over. This was all rather sudden. The engine then peered at the tank engine, who then looked away as a result. He felt rather uncomfortable. "I think it's a little late to speak with our director now," replied the engine at last. but you're more than welcome to stay in the sheds here until tomorrow at least. I can show you to them now." "Oh, thank you," sighed the driver. "If that's all right, of course. I wouldn't want to interrupt your work." "Oh, it's perfectly all right. I just brought over some coal for the station tomorrow. Ghastly weather it's been lately, though I'm sure you know all about that." "Indeed," replied the driver. "Thank you again. We really appreciate it." As he climbed back into the cab, the tender engine looked back to the tank engine. "You've been through a lot, I see," he whispered. The tank engine stared. What do you mean?" he asked. "I can see it in your face. Whatever you've endured has taken a heavy toll." "It's all right. You don't have to share the details." The tank engine said nothing. He wasn't sure what to make of this other engine, but he did begin to feel at ease around him. "Oh, forgive me. I should probably introduce myself, shouldn't I?" said the tender engine. "My name is Edward. What's yours?" The tank engine paused. It wasn't that he didn't have a name. It was more that in his old working area, he was rarely referred to by it. Perhaps here, it would be different. Thomas. It's Thomas," he finally said. "Well, Thomas," smiled Edward, "welcome to the island of Sodor. Should your stay here be permanent, I hope it will be a pleasant one for you." It took a while, but Thomas managed to smile back. In spite of all he had gone through, it seemed that his nightmare would become a distant memory. At last, things were looking up for him.